let me now introduce our guest for tonight, Dr. Kaya Barry, who's an artist and cultural geographer at Griffith. She works in the areas of mobilities, migration, tourism, material cultures, and arts research. Her research explores how mobility and migration experiences are conditioned through materiality, everyday routines, and, importantly, visual aesthetics. She was awarded an ARC DECRA in 2022 for a project exploring the experiences of seasonal migrants and backpackers who undertake farm work in regional Queensland. So we'll be talking about that later today as well. And prior to this, Kaya was an associate professor at Aalborg University in Denmark from 21 to 2022, and a Griffith University Postdoctoral Research Fellow from 2018 to 2021. She's got an extensive publication list. If any of you have checked her out, you'll see that she publishes widely and extensively, including in journals such as Mobilities, Applied Mobilities, and Social and Cultural Geography, but obviously there's many more as well. She's also a photography curator and has exhibited exhibitions about protests, seasonal work in Queensland, both in Brisbane at the Powerhouse and across rural Queensland as well, and has an exhibition that will be traveling over the next months as well. The format of the seminar, obviously many of you already know, but we'll do 30 minutes of interview-style conversation between me and Kaya, and then we'll move over to 30 minutes of questions from those of you in the room and those of you online as well. And then afterwards, we'll, in person, go and have drinks and dinner. Those of you online would be invited, but obviously can't attend, so we'll continue our conversation then. So let's just jump straight into it. I think a lot of people in the room today don't really know what geographers do or what you're interested in, what you study. That's all bad. So what is it that you and colleagues like Samid next to you study? What's your subject of research?
Thanks, and thanks for having me here. Yes, I am a human geographer. I suppose geographers are very preoccupied with space and place. In human geography, it's quite an attentiveness to place and landscape, as well as weather and other kinds of conditions that go around cultural and social life of humans and others. But I also have an arts background, so my undergraduate and even my PhD was in creative arts. But thematically, all my work is around the field of mobilities studies. So mobilities, plural, is, I guess, we're interested in how things move, what's on the move, the kinds of speeds, trajectories, intensities of all kinds of things that are moving. So it might be people, as in, travel, migration. It could be different scales of movement and how these kinds of qualitative, kind of evocative sort of situations of movement move us in different ways, and the different agencies and powers that produce different movements. But it can be movement of infrastructure or ideas or non-humans, environmental movements. So yeah, I guess broadly speaking, it's, mobilities is the thing that ties all of my work together through human geography, but as well as the creative and the artistic practice that I've always had.
So that's obviously a very broad theme, and when I was reading your work and perusing it, obviously there's a lot, it's very eclectic, there's a big mix and so on.
Yeah.
And so obviously with scholars, I think in every field, something that, and this probably happens later on in your career, but something scholars start to worry about is how they're going to come up with their next idea, their next project and so on. Yeah. And so I was kind of wondering how that process looks for you, how you get inspired to, how does this eclectic mix take shape? And
yeah, well, I'm a little bit, I guess, like you could say a bowerbird, or the dog sniffing out the car window going, oh my god, look at that, and that's fun, and it's good to do research that you enjoy and you're passionate about, but I suppose maybe in career advice it's also not the greatest thing to do. But I think having that common thread is what's helped me, like around movement and mobility. But early on, my PhD topic came out of my own experience of travel and particularly backpacking and these kinds of spaces that people on the move for all kinds of reasons inhabit. That logically led to what I'm doing now about, communal places where people live and travel and work and move through, which is what my DECRA project is sort of interested in the Australian context. But I suppose, a lot of mobility scholars, like the more sort of foundational people working in the space when it originated, over 20 years ago, they were also very eclectic in what's moving. It was this really exciting moment, particularly in the cultural turn in geography, but in sociology and, STS kind of work, that isn't it exciting that all these things move or don't move. So the immobile experience is really something that I think is quite probably at the forefront of that sort of research now, and that's certainly the tensions between people who are mobile, highly mobile for their work and migration requirements, but equally how that makes and renders different kinds of powers of unjust mobility, where people are forced into being interstasis or assume that that being static is the preferred way of being. So yeah, I hope that answers what you were asking.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Just to stay on that mobilities issue, obviously a lot of your work involves you moving as well, right? Locally, obviously, a lot of it locally, but also internationally. And so when you're talking about the sort of the constraints that are placed on people, right, and the different forms of mobility and immobility and so on that you're studying, do you see these reflected as well as a researcher when obviously you have to travel?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've been really trying to wrestle with in myself. I've been very lucky in having funding and financial support, but of course, I'm a white Australian passport holding person, who is an able-bodied person who can endure a long flight and cross borders with ease. So that's something that I'm really trying to, I've written a few things about, and I'm writing some more stuff around, and not to dwell on me as that person, but I suppose think about what kinds of academic research gets reproduced over and over again by having this kinetic elite of academics do research in that way. I think it's something we should be reflecting on, whether it's just in terms of carbon emissions or the injustices of funding in institutions, but also I think it changes what kinds of research and what kinds of questions get asked and who by. So that's quite on my mind at the moment.
I'm going to skip ahead to a question I had about methods and your writing style, because I think it connects very well with what we're talking about now. But I was very struck by the clarity of your writing and the style, if we can call it a style. Maybe you will push back on that, but it's very funny at times, which is not a common thing for academic writing. It uses language that I think a lot of academics would say is informal, like you call people blokes or guys, stuff like that. And I was wondering maybe if you could, just connecting it back to the fact that we were talking about these differences in access and differences in mobilities surrounding academia, if this is at all connected to that, and this is a practice you're pursuing for those reasons, or maybe just how that sort of writing style came about.
I think it's a little bit about finding confidence in your own voice, which, moving into a mid-career kind of position has allowed me to do, like through writing a lot and also, being willing to be vulnerable in peer review feedback and the kinds of criticisms you get and what you aspects you'd like to fight for and aspects you're willing to let go in your writing. But I think the projects where I've written extensively first person and tried to really have a story or narrative carry through, they're projects that are about particularly country communities and, you know, like rural places where, you know, through the necessity of the project that I'm doing, you have to speak in plain language. You have to kind of, you know, be pretty loose with language and use a lot of abbreviations. And I think that really, it's very Australian. It's very Queensland. And I think that's been kind of something I've had fun with writing and playing with that. It's obviously not suited to everything, but I think it's also a little bit of a pushback of, you know, the very middle classness of academic writing, and writing and language is important, but there are, you know, times and places where I know the stark contrast between my academic tone and the interview quotes from participants where English is another language and expressing themselves is really difficult. Like how those sit together on the page I find uncomfortable, and so maybe it's just a technique that I'm working through in that way. I mean, I do creative research. I would be very clear, it's not creative writing I'm trying to do, but I think it's embracing that narrative that comes through place and the kinds of language interactions you have in place too.
On the creative research side of things, obviously you use you know, a broad range of methods that qualify as creative or arts-based research, maybe, like obviously you do ethnographies and so on, but also, you know, visual essays, and you use a lot of visual methods and so on. Do you think that offers us a different perspective on migration issues, or why have you chosen to pursue that? Obviously you have a background in it, but... Yeah,
I mean, the default response would be, well, I'm an artist first and foremost. But I think I've made deliberate decisions not to do arts-based research in different capacities in my research projects. But it does allow a different kind of expression, and I guess, you know, to talk about language, it does allow beyond the textual and beyond the verbal that you can find common ground within yourself and with participants and communities, that gives different kinds of sensitivities and evokes different emotional responses and, you know, produces different affects with what you're doing. It's not, for me, it's the creative practice is part of the research. I mean, even when I write papers that don't have any creative component, I think how I think through these ideas and concepts often comes through my own, you know, sketching and diagramming and doing things. So I'm always kind of thinking through that process way. But to me, it's never just the outcome, like the final exhibition. It's part of the research design, really foregrounded. Yeah.
I feel like, you know, just to go back to the vulnerability part of the discussion, you also include your failures a lot. There's an article about making jam.
Yeah.
And, you're clearly not an expert jam maker.
No.
But I think that including those sort of failures is, you know, was equally as refreshing as, you know, the writing as well. So I really appreciated that. Obviously, with arts-based methods, you know, you talk about the process as being integral to sort of getting to grips with whatever you're studying. But also, you know, you produce outputs, right? So you have a research project about seasonal work in regional Queensland, and it yielded an exhibition, a photography exhibition, which included the work of farm workers. So yeah, I'd be really interested to hear both, you know, about, you know, what led to that project, how the participants engaged with you, what they thought about the final product as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was this project, because it's the 3-year ARC DECRA, and I always knew there would be a creative component and an exhibition outcome, because that was written into the design when I applied. But one of the things that I found really frustrating was the way that particularly Pacific people, because there's they're one of the target groups of this project, people on the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Visa. The way that they're represented and I suppose aestheticised in Australian public discourse, let alone just media and government kind of promotion of this visa, is really quite stock standard normative, and the only time and space we see of these people in the media or in public spaces is either really historicised photos of, you know, enslaved workers from the Pacific, or them in the news either being really smiling and grateful to be employed, or when things go wrong. So I wanted to, I suppose I gave out disposable cameras to participants all over the state and a post bag and said, show me what a week in your life looks like. And most people, not all, but most people were quite sort of, I guess, perplexed by, you want to see what I do in a week, you know, and that, you know, the fact that these people, they never get to occupy public space, and yet they're the backbone of our agricultural industry now. And so it was wonderful. I got all these cameras posted back, I got the film developed, and that was part of the mystery, because they would take a photo, but they couldn't preview or delete or edit. So it was this quite uncensored sort of insight into a week in, you know, a farm worker's life. And then the exhibition I curated, so I selected the photos, I'd had their consent and everything was done ethically, and some workers wanted a copy of their photos, some didn't, which I found really interesting. So different kinds of values around what a photograph means and how it travels too is something that I've sort of taken out of it. But yeah, I curated the exhibition, and it shows a lot of really mundane, like really kind of gritty nature of their work and their labour and their lives, but also shows some really quite, there's a lot of smiling and posing for the camera, but it's not in the same frame that Home Affairs or DFAT would market the visa as. It's from their perspective. It's them smiling outside KFC. It's them, you know, laughing at the fact that they've missed the once a day public bus back to their hometown where they're working. You know, it's there's a different kind of story that happens that comes from them having agency, and to see that in public space, and the media picked it up, ABC did a lot of promotion about it, was just really, really lovely. So I've been really happy with how that project turned out.
And it's still travelling, it's not over yet.
Yeah, so I've got over 1,000 photographs now, but the exhibition is around 40 to 50 photographs, and it will travel in various sizes next year to a few different galleries, and maybe hopefully beyond that too. Yeah.
So when you were curating this selection of 40, were you looking for anything in particular, or what sort of was guiding your selection?
I mean, to be honest, I was looking, my own interest in the kinds of visualities and aesthetics came into it. So I found a lot of the landscape photos where they captured the place really interesting, so there are a lot of those. But in saying that, you'll have a photograph and it'll be of, you know, one guy kind of mid-distance up a ladder picking citrus, and it sort of has this, like, the person who took the photo, it's their workmate, it's their mate they share a hostel room with, they know intimately, but then you as the viewer, you kind of plucked in looking from afar, and it sort of anonymizes this again, so it sort of distances you. And a lot of the photos of people working in the fields was like that. But then the other sort of real line that I pursued was the really mundane, the really unglamorous shots that you just don't see of farm work, like people sitting in the dirt eating their lunch, you know, because there's no seating on farms, you know, there's no shade, so they're sitting there and they've got their hats or their coats sort of over them to give them shade, or, you know, like sleeping on the side of a tractor wheel, and you know, these kinds of moments that I think they're quite potent and powerful. And certainly the response I've had from a lot of different, you know, government agencies and industry groups have been like, oh wow, we don't usually see that, which is exactly the point, you know, to kind of platform these experiences as a much more diverse, you know, visual vocabulary of what it's like. So.
Is that something these organizations are interested in pursuing, or is...
No.
No.
No, not really. No. There's so much censorship around these visas, because the PALM visa for the Pacific workers and the Working Holiday Maker, which is for backpackers from almost 50 nations now, like we're talking about 350,000 people who become essential workers to Australia, and so they want to attract people to come and make money and have fun, you know, like have a good time and enrich your lives by doing the work that Australians won't do. So there's a definite kind of narrative to all the media and imagery that they promote. They don't want to see people sitting, eating their lunch out of, you know, a reusable, you know, Tupperware container on the side of a field in the dirt. They don't want to see that. So I think that, and that's something that actually a lot of the participants, like I purposefully didn't do photo elicitation, so I didn't go back and ask people, what's your favourite photograph, or tell me about what's happening here, because I wanted, the language barriers and challenges are too vast, I think, to do that ethically and well. But I wanted to sort of, I suppose, like they took the time to take that photograph, so obviously there was a purpose to it. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, you know, these sort of creative methods and, you know, international relations, politics, which is what is mostly done in this building, or this floor at least. And so I was wondering if you thought that perhaps some of these methods might be better suited to fields like geography, psychology, sociology, and if you have any thoughts about, you know, when we're thinking about international relations, oftentimes scholars think, you know, it's at the state level, the international level. What can arts-based methods bring to the study of this sort of topic? Obviously, this is, you know, your perspective as a geographer, but...
Yeah, I mean, geography and art have been very closely linked, and in my earlier work, talking about like art and mobility, there's a long lineage of kind of that ethnographic sort of persuasion in both arts practices from, say, the 20s onwards, and in, you know, the cultural turn in geography that really kind of drew attention to the everyday and how we engage with site and place and landscape. So there's a lot of overlap with geography, and I think maybe as geographers would like me to say that yes, that's where it belongs. But I mean, the arts and practice-led research can be done in any topic, you know, and it should be. So I don't think it's exclusively that kind of soft social science research exclusively that inhabits that space. I think it's maybe just we haven't had enough interdisciplinary kind of mixing in other disciplines that are a little more rigid in style and form of research design and research publications as well. But certainly, like, there's really great stuff. I mean, there's a lot, like, art is always political, and there's a lot of politics being done by people who might be trained as a practice-led researcher and who are working on IR topics or, you know, international or global kinds of concerns, but they perhaps are just not publishing in those areas around their work. So there's lots of room for it, but it's, you know, it's always on the margins, I think. Still, Australia is a pretty accepting, you know, institutionally of creative research, but it's still a struggle to get things reported unless it's in a white box gallery or a performance at a, you know, a established cultural institution. It's hard to make a case that this should be equivalent to a journal article, even though it went through months and months of development. And
so, in a practical sense, for, you know, people like myself or, you know, PhD students here who are sort of very interested in arts-based methods but don't have an arts background necessarily or have never done it before and so on, do you have any advice or resources or...
I mean, there's some wonderful books being written about practice-led research. There's quite a lot of sort of more handbook type stuff being written in geography, particularly, more so than other disciplines that I'm aware of. But it's, I think for undergrad or postgrad, students who want to pursue this, I think you've got to have good support and backing from your supervision team of why this is great. You've got to have someone on board, and even if it's not within the supervision arrangements, find a mentor who does this kind of work, because there's a lot of benefits, but there's also a lot of challenges to overcome with how you report it, where you get funding, what actually will count as significant research. But it's something that I think there's more and more resources available that people can turn to, and more people should have a go. It's great.
And then finally, I would ask you, before we move to questions from the room and online, where your DECRA is headed. It's not over yet. Are you working on anything exciting? Anything troubling? Anything?
I'm working on many things troubling. I've got another few months to sort of wrap it up, and but the project I think will extend for the next couple of years in different ways, and obviously all the data that I've collected. At the moment, I think it's really about kind of leading on from the exhibitions about how to use the data, but also the relationships and the support that I've had from workers, but also a lot of the communities who host them and support them while they're here in Australia, of how to do something that can have quite material changes to this visa program, because although it is a beneficial remittance style program for many people who take part of it, there's a lot of assumptions about who hosts them, who takes care of them, so especially for smaller rural communities, there's a lot of pressure that hosting international workers brings, the same way that FIFO workers put pressure on a rural community. So I think finding ways that I could use some of the data, but also some of the publicity and public attention that I've been really lucky to generate is sort of where I'm heading next with the project, and we just see what happens. There's a lot of room for change in the visa that I'd like to see happen.
So you're talking about sort of advocacy, scholarship, hybrid kind of work, or?
Yeah, I suppose, it might just be making more publicly accessible stuff. So whether that's writing that maybe I choose not to publish it in a journal and I publish it in a more public sort of accessible blog post or media engagement that platforms this. Like next year we've got a Radio National program happening down in Canberra that's going to be about the Pacific labour mobility, so that'll be great, and we'll get some workers there, and I guess finding ways to use the energy and momentum and support that I've had from lots of people through the project to actually give a bit more space to this issue, because most Australians don't know who picks their fruit. They don't know anything about the kinds of conditions that people live in, and also that they have no idea of the impact that this mobility has on Australia outside of metro areas. So it might be in that way, it might be in direct sort of policy suggestions and recommendations, but I don't know. that's where I am. I've got a lot of wealth of data and connections that I don't know what to do with. I'm just a researcher, right?
Well, you don't have to figure it all out right away.
No.
On that open-ended note, perhaps we'll turn to the room and online for questions.